And welcome everyone. My name's Jennifer Walinga and I'm a professor in the School of Communication and Culture at Royal Roads University. Great to see some familiar names and faces and also welcoming some new names and faces. Welcome to the webinar series, Sport, Leadership and Social Change. We've been running for a couple of years now and it's always wonderful to talk about these issues, talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the great opportunities that we are experiencing in sport in Canada and across the world. I'm particularly excited about this episode because it's really marking quite a turning point for us. We've had the beloved Amara Angus supporting us for several months now, and she's moving into a new role. So I have to bid her farewell in some ways. Of course, we'll still be interacting at Royal Roads University, but I really want to put a shout out to Amara, who's been just such a wonderful, insightful, supportive, and enthusiastic coach all the way through this, really. And I want to welcome our panelists. I'll give a few more introductions a little bit later here, but I always start with a bit of a preamble around the webinar series itself. And yes, I see people participating in the chat, and I encourage you to keep going. And there'll be lots of chances to post questions and even poke in with your mic on if you want to participate in the conversation. And sometimes we have time at the end as well, where we can devote particularly to a broader conversation. So welcome everyone. We have always over 100 people registered. So of course you'll get the recording and you can share that widely with friends who may have had to miss it today. And we always want to start by acknowledging and thanking the Lekwungen and Kusepsin First Nations, because we are very lucky and fortunate to be living and teaching and learning on the lands, their lands. These are unceded territories. We are in a remarkable position at Royal Roads where the lands have been relinquished really by the Department of National Defense, who have kind of owned the lands for several years, but now we really are working directly in partnership with those who actually the lands belong to. And it's wonderful because I think at our university, we've really taken this seriously. The work of truth and reconciliation is really important. And I constantly draw parallels to sport because we're going through our own very deep soul searching kind of truth and reconciliation process as well. And there's so much to learn from the processes we're going through with our Indigenous partners. We at Royal Roads try to learn from the land. It's an integral part of our educational model. There's so much to learn from the systems and the ecosystems, natural properties and principles that surround us. And we're lucky to be surrounded by 300 hectares of old growth forest. One of our trees is over 1,000 years old. Think about that for a moment. And of course, we also are lucky to have benefited from several gardens that were developed over the years on our property. And we use the bridge in our School of Communication and Culture as our vision and metaphor for not only building bridges, but also acknowledging the different sides that we begin from, right? Understanding diversity is crucial to building connections and understanding. And of course, in sport, we know the power of diversity. It's essential to experiencing the synergy that's possible within a really high functioning team. I always want to highlight the learning and teaching research model at Royal Roads. It's something we're really proud of. It's based on this acronym of ACT, action, and actually trying to facilitate positive social change in the world. Our graduates talk often about the experience being life-changing, and that's a tagline we've really we've generated, but also really try to own, because it's based on these principles of being more applied and authentic, always grounded in this concept of caring and community, and ultimately focused on transformation. If you can experience personal transformation, you're better equipped to facilitate transformation in others and in the community. Today, we'll talk about sport. And I always want to remind people that there is truth in sport, just like there is in nature and in art and literature. There's so many principles and concepts that we can be distilling from sport. And so that's a lot of the work that we do in this webinar series is sport is struggling. What can we learn from sport to help us do better in sport? Because we know the power of sport. We know sport has an incredible platform and really just incredible principles that we can be leveraging to better humanity. I mean, the whole purpose of sport is to develop and build humans, but also our human communities and society as a whole. Our programs reflect a lot of these same principles of development, diversity, education, the environment, sustainability, equity and human rights, health, media and communication, and peace. And we see these kinds of concepts made more explicit through a number of sport organizations across the world. And there's our Andrea. She's on the webinar today, poster child for some of the partnerships that we enjoy at Royal Roads with well, you know, we really try to acknowledge professional experience. It's part of our model that we have this prior learning assessment. So we acknowledge your professional experience for credit, and we do the same with athletes. You know, sport is an education, so you've definitely learned all sorts of skills and knowledge that you can then bring into different contexts. We are also working on different programs in sport. We have a partnership with the CFL around leadership development. And we have some courses around sport leadership, governance, and my favorite course, Sport for Society. So today we'll be talking about values-based sport, and we have a number of young leaders, I've been calling them. I hope that's not offensive, but they really are. They're leaders and on the younger end of the spectrum. And I think just really bringing their ideas into the sport world and have so much to offer. And I'm really excited about them moving into these roles of leadership. So we'll be talking about what are some of the projects and ideas, what some of the research that these people have conducted, but also what is the professional work that they're doing right now that centers around this concept of values-based leadership. And how does the work that they're doing enhancing the sports system in Canada? All of these individuals are working in different areas of their professional lives. It's not always just sport, but they do have a foot in sport as well. And so our panelists today, we welcome Andrea Burk. You saw her earlier on one of the slides, and she's a silver medalist from the 2014 Rugby World Cup. And Andrea is an interesting example of someone who came in to do her master's with Royal Roads University, took a year out to participate in the World Cup, and then came back to finish and finished her research. So it's a great illustration of how flexible the learning can be here and how it acknowledges your professional pursuits as well. She's a recent graduate of the MA in Leadership, or MAL program, recently conducted a study on what the Canadian Olympic and Paralympic Sport Institute Network, or COPSI network, can learn from COVID. So she and I worked on that together and had some great insights. We still have to produce that paper, but we're working on it. And we have Danielle Cyr. Danielle is an amazing person, soccer athlete and coach, a graduate of the MA in Professional Communication degree. And so I first met Danielle in our MAPSI program, and we connected immediately on the topic of sport. Currently conducting their doctoral research on performance sport for leadership and community development as a conduit for safer sport experiences. Danielle and I, supervising Danielle, we've had lots of conversations around how do what is it that we're really trying to develop and for what purpose? We often try to link it to performance, but is that the real purpose of sport, or is it broader than that? So it's always an interesting conversation. I'm sure we'll get to that a bit today as well. And has been working with the CCAA, but also with Canadian Women in Sport, and now is back in a coaching role. And we've got Jane Gumley. It's been fascinating watching Jane begin as a rower and part of the national team with Rowing Canada. Current graduate student, so currently enrolled in the MAL program and working on understanding, so really at the beginning of framing her research. So it's been fun to participate as one of her committee members on that and looking at modern coaching methods for the modern athlete. We often talk about, these kids these days, but I'm so excited about these kids these days because I think they're brave, courageous, and they're not standing for some of the abusive strategies that have been employed in the past. So I'm really excited about the future because of the young people involved in sport. Jane's also a two-time Coach of the Year and led her University of Victoria crew to win the Canadian Kura Champs, the banner last year. It was great to watch. We also have Sam Heron. Samantha has a history with rowing as well. and also spent some time coaching para, which I think sparked some real interest around diversity and inclusion for her. And as she entered into the MA in Conflict Analysis and Management program, wonderful to watch her explore this idea of cultural conflict. You know, we have values that we state and espouse, and yet then our practices can come into conflict with that. And you see that happening within elite sport, and especially para sport. So how can we better leverage para principles and to deliver inclusivity, not just in sport, but across the world? Because I think sport para is a wonderful model for that. And Natasha Watcham-Roy, who's an Olympic bronze medalist in rugby sevens. So Andrea's rugby 15s, has also played sevens, but Natasha is in the sevens program and a recent graduate of the MAL program as well, a real flagship program for Royal Roads, one of our first, a leadership program. And her research focused on and was pretty recently completed on the role of psychological safety in the Rugby Canada environment. And Andrea was also looking at culture within the Rugby Sevens environment. So it's interesting to see those two studies mesh. And Natasha and I actually I just presented on her behalf her study to the International Association of Sport Communication. And we'll be working on that paper together. So welcome, everyone. I just have one more thing, a reminder to pose questions in the chat all the way through. We'll be watching and monitoring, and we'll try to weave that into the discussion or invite you in to share your question, turn the mic on and participate in conversation. But you can also just wait till the end, and we'll have some time where we can really dig into some other questions from the audience. And a reminder that you can follow any one of these individuals on social, on Insta, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you want to find them. And next up, we have an episode 24, which is community-based safe sport programming. What's happening across our communities at the more local level. There's some great work being done. So I really wanted to showcase some of those, and it's being done all over Canada, but a few that have agreed to participate and share some of the work that they're doing: Sport Manitoba, BC, Yukon, Quebec, and Nova Scotia. So thank you, everyone, and let's get started. I always like to begin, I give a bit of an intro, but the real introduction comes when we ask our panelists to share a little more about their journey into sport, through sport, and in what ways are they still connected to sport, what makes them want to study sport or work on behalf of sport. What is it that keeps you motivated, especially right now when it seems like every week there's another story about the crisis that we're facing in sport. So anybody like to start? If you just turn on your mic, I can see who's ready to rock. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take it away because I have been here before, and I know that there's a couple other panelists who have been here before, but as I mentioned, I'm Samantha. I go by she and her. And when I reflect on how I got here, I was always very privileged as an athlete and then as an employee in sport to work on my education at the same time. And so as I explored a career specific to rowing and para-rowing and with the performance space, I was also completing my master's in conflict analysis and management. And throughout that work, because I'm a person who struggles to say no and always feels very grateful for a lot of different opportunities I have, I've been working with different organizations in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. Currently now, my principal work is for Blue Heron Resolutions, where I'm working in mediation and conflict management, and specific contracts or specific partners that I work with are ITP Sport and Recreation around complaint management, as well as One Ability, which is this fantastic disability sport collective in Victoria, and some work for Inclusion Incorporated, supporting them with their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And so while some of those projects seem vastly different, and I'll also throw in that there's some research that I did with my master's and that I'm currently doing with Jen and Royal Roads right now. While all of that work is vastly different, there are definitely some synergies and just interconnections when you see the most extreme end of these conflict spaces, as well as some of the positive work we're doing in the diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces and disability sport spaces. So happy to kind of make those connections and connect with another really great panel on similar topics.
Yeah, and I'd love to pull on those threads further, you know, the role of mediation in solving some of the challenges we're facing in sport, but also, yeah, the importance of diversity and inclusion, something we're wrestling with in sport, but you know, what are the opportunities and what needs to be teased out so we better understand what we're doing. Thank you. And who would like to go next? Great, go ahead, Natasha.
I'll hop in. Hi, I'm Tash, also Natasha. I'm joining you from Vancouver, BC, which is on the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Nation. Super happy to be here with you all today. I was with the National Sevens team for about 4 years. And I think after leaving that and my experience, I really wanted to have an impact on sport and create positive change. So this is where I found the Masters of Arts in Leadership and actually met with Jen to inquire further about it and really focus on collaborating with the athletes to figure out what they needed in order to feel psychologically safe in their environment. So really, like, how can they feel more included, safe to learn, contribute, and challenge the status quo. And through my experience with my thesis in that, I've continued to work with Jen on a cultural rebuild and supporting Rugby Canada with that. And I just love the work and discovering in collaboration with organizations and athletes what they feel is necessary to move forward and be safe in sport. And that's me. And I also work at Lululemon, which is fun. Who doesn't like Lululemon? No, it's okay if you do.
Right on, thanks, Tash. And go ahead, Danielle.
I can jump in. Yeah, my name is Danielle. I'm joining from Mi'kmaq on the east coast of Turtle Island, the unceded ancestral territory of Mi'kmaq people. My pronouns are they, them. So yeah, I grew up a multi-sport athlete from rural Nova Scotia. I went to a high school where you played one sport, you kind of had to play them all or there wasn't going to be a team. So I was really lucky in that regard that I had a wonderful childhood, adolescence with lots of sports. Came from a bit of a sport family with my brother and my dad. Getting to coaching when I was in high school, ended up having the opportunity to play soccer at university, which was fantastic. At that time, I ended up doing an undergrad in public relations and then ended up working within nonprofit sport and health for about 5-6 years. Decided I wanted to go back and do my master's. So I ended up finding Royal Roads and Jen Walinga was one of the big draws to come to Royal Roads. And then ended up just actually really enjoying the research process. Through all of that, I ended up continuing on my coaching journey within soccer, ended up taking over a university program here in Halifax at Mount St. Vincent University. And I think I've been the head coach there for about 8 years. So through that process, for me, I was really interested in how we could be intentional with our environment at the Mount in developing transformational leadership skills for our female student athletes. So kind of on my journey as well, just through my experiences, gender equity has definitely been a core lens or value or principle within the work that I've done. So again, within that environment for my master's, what we looked at is how we could actually use our university environment to develop those leadership skills with our female student athletes. So one, we found that the university environment could do that, but there was this piece around intentionality that was really important. And again, the key role that athletic leaders played in that was very important. So that's kind of where I'm at right now is doing my PhD research at Royal Roads and investigating, what stops us as athletic leaders from being able to actually use our environments and performance sports specifically for leadership, social, human, community development. So as I've gone through this process, connecting with safe sport as well, right? We know organizationally, and we'll probably get into this a bit more, right? That there's different value structures that perpetuate unsafe sport. So what I'm really curious at looking at now is, can we repurpose those for leadership, social, community development to create really strong performance sport experiences? So, and with that, I continue to do a little bit of coaching within the club environment and provincial and recs, but it's kind of where I'm at right now.
So we're hearing about inclusivity and around safety and leadership potentialities, but there are these things that get in the way. Hey, yeah, we'll definitely dig in more. Thank you. And who'd like to go next? Go ahead, Andrea.
Hi, Andrea Burk. I am calling in from Toronto, and I love this question, right? It is what drew me to sport, honestly, and my answer has to do with like, how do we continue with sport and how do we continue to like make this values-based sport system, something that's healthy and thriving. And what drew me to sport was simply just the exploration and the curiosity of how far can I go, right? So when I was playing rugby and I enjoyed it. So I thought I would travel, continue on that path. And I got one international cap and I thought, oh gosh, I think I can do another. And then I got two and I was like, oh gosh, I think I can do more, and long story short, 2014 comes around and I felt that I was still maintaining that same mentality. And it felt like the team had the same mentality. And it was like, let's try this on. Let's see how far we can go. And we ended up going into a World Cup World Cup final, finishing with a silver medal. And that to me is still one of my peak experiences in my life. I continued to play and my values shifted because I really loved that shiny little medal that was coming around, that was hanging around my neck. And I wanted more, right? I wanted the gold this time. And I believe that I became a bit of a psychopath on that, right? Because I could never, nothing was ever good enough to get that gold. I had moved away from the let's see what's possible realm and was thoroughly surprised into this place of feeling like I was always falling short and I was never good enough. And I can feel it right now, right? Like the difference in the strength behind those two positions and two intentions as I was entering into playing sport as an athlete and even in my life today. So that's a little bit of me on a personal level. The research that Jen and I had been doing was looking at what can we learn from COVID, and all of, a lot of what we found aligns with it, is like going with that strengths-based approach, having a level of autonomy, but also an interdependency with the rest of your teammates or, your governing body or authoritative structure, so to speak. So I will leave it at that, and I'm sure we'll dive into it a little bit further. And I believe we still have to hear from Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Thanks for sharing and being so authentic, because it truly is, I think, that tension that Danielle was describing, right? These two poles, and how do we find a way forward that honors all of those desires and dreams? Love it. Go ahead, Jane. Great to see you here.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me on here. This is my first webinar, so very excited. If I stumble around a little bit, it's my first time. But yeah, first little shout out. There's a couple people from my MAL program in here, which I'm really excited to see. Thanks for coming. But yeah, a little bit about my background. Similar to a few of the other panelists, I've been in sport my whole life, multi-sport athlete from a young age, and kind of fell into rowing in high school and really liked it. So I just kept on going with it. And that, very similar to what Andrea was saying, it's just kind of seeing how far I could go. And that's what excited me and kept me coming back for more and going into university. I stepped away from rowing for a couple of years after university, and then the opportunity came up for me to try out for the national team. And again, that fire kind of lit up of, wow, like maybe I could do this. So I went for it, and was super fortunate to be on the team and represent Team Canada at World Championships. And yeah, the experience there was different for sure. Not exactly what I expected. And I think that's what kind of put me into what I ended up, where I am currently focusing on for my studies, which is supporting today's athletes and modern coaches, supporting modern athletes, mainly because I wasn't, like, to be honest, super satisfied with my time on the national team. And I just felt like there wasn't a big focus on having a growth mindset and like helping athletes get up to where they could be, or supporting that. And that is what I really value myself as a coach, and try and get through with my athletes and teach them. So that is kind of what I'm studying now.
Yeah, great. And isn't it fascinating, right? To see how, whether it's a positive or a negative, it causes us to want to know more and be curious and learn. It shapes your directions in many ways. I think it's important for all of you too. I just want to remind you all to kind of spend some time. You've just answered, the pathways and the links, but really explicating that for yourselves and articulating that, I think, is a pretty powerful exercise. So keep going. And I also want to get us all together and do something together. I feel like all of these interdisciplinary perspectives would really lead to something pretty cool, hey? But I also need to settle down sometimes because I get too many things in the air. All right. I also wanted to push a little further on that first question around, so what makes sport worth even saving? What makes sport worth researching, understanding better? Is it, a lot of people would argue it's too far gone. What do you think?
I can jump in right away, I guess.
Good, go for it, Jane.
And if I'm on the wrong track here, you can always pull me back, but
Right
maybe
answer.
there isn't a wrong track. What makes it worth saving? I mean, sport teaches you just so much, right? Like, it teaches you so much about yourself, how much about being on a team. I was at the Sport BC celebration, I guess, a couple weeks ago, and Evan Dunphy made a really solid point. Who's the Canadian speed walker who won a bronze medal at the last Olympics. And he was saying, if you look at sport, and his sport particularly, he's like, I can walk really fast from one place to another. Like, that doesn't really translate to much else in life other than maybe being a really good messenger. And I thought that was really funny. He's like, but what sport teaches you, like what you learn in sport, you can take into so many other things in life. And like, that's what makes it so worthwhile. It can and should be a safe space for you to experiment and push yourself and stretch yourself both physically and mentally, and learn things that then you can take into the working world or into your family life and that kind of stuff. So that's how I feel.
Love that, right? We often get that in rowing too. You're going backwards in a boat, like, who cares? But it doesn't matter what it is, whether you're hitting a birdie or you're walking faster, or art or literature, anything, right? There's the learning involved. Tash, go ahead.
Sorry. I think for me, it's like two-part. Like, I have learned a lot, like built such a big community in sport, and especially in rugby. There's something so special about, well, for me, for rugby, you're always together. You have the same goal. You're going to fight for the same thing on the field, and it really brings you together in a way that I've never experienced since leaving sport and leaving rugby. The community, the resilience, all the different aspects of the game you need to navigate as they come at you. And then on another side is, okay, my experience, similar to Jane, I left, I would say, unsatisfied as well in my experience, and left on a note I wouldn't have wanted to leave on, but I am thankful for that. Because I was forced to dig into parts of myself that I didn't really understand, and that the moments that I experienced, actually I grew from. So even if sport sometimes is hard and there's things you experience, I think you can learn a lot from it, and we can continue to build. And I wouldn't change my experience for the world, because I am where I am now, and I get to give back to sport and make hopefully some sort of impact as we continue to research and navigate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Tash. And Sam?
Yeah, I get 3 points on it. And personally, sport has always been a medium to practice and exercise a skill set and a set of values. And I really do believe that sport often reflects like what we see in society. And I think an interesting example is, if you reflect on the news recently, you would have seen all of the dialogue around Canada women's soccer, and the conversation around equitable pay, and the conversation around making sure that athletes who are on a world stage and visible in that sense have access to these basic rights. And sport is a real way where we see, for example, example, a group of women or female identifying individuals expressing that value and expressing the advocacy required to access equal pay. And then the other piece is that sport is so often a place for belonging, or should be a place for belonging. When you think about newcomers to Canada, this would be a way to access community and to connect with youth. And we need to support the systems that allow people to access that versus create more division and more challenge in having safe and simply fun sport spaces for so many members of our community as we link it to our physical health, our social health, our emotional health. So those are really the pieces that I focus on when we kind of take a step back and look at why do we want to continue supporting sport.
It's such an intense environment, hey? And it brings into such stark relief the need to come together because you got to face an adversity, or the need for a shared goal, which we don't always get in an organization. It's always a bit, it can be, not always, but it can be kind of muted or intangible. And yet we know from sport, the more clear the shared goal, the more people will galvanize, right? And the same, the need for belonging is so intense in sport to create that space, because we need you right now, right? If we're going to play this game. So it's such a beautiful environment if we leverage it. But you can also see always the flip side, where if we misinterpret it or don't get it right, it can take us down this horrendous path, which of course we're seeing. But back to Tasha's point, where, well, would we trade that? You know, these mistakes we're making in sport are actually these fertile grounds for us to learn and do better. Danielle.
I think just building off of Sam's point around connection, I know for me, that was probably the reason why I started when I was 5, and the reason why I continue to coach now, and just have loved, you know, the game growing up, you know, developing a sense of self-worth, you know, building a really strong network. I know I joke with our university athletes that if I didn't have soccer, I don't know how I'd make friends. When I look at the network that I have, it's probably 95% soccer people, and the other 5% is people I've met through soccer people. But again, like this sense of connection, and for me, so I've had the opportunity for the past couple of years to work with a gender diverse athlete. So we talk about belonging. To the point about a year and a half ago where he was just struggling, really struggling in high school, really struggling in his club environment. And I knew, okay, the one environment that I can control, that I know can be a safe space, is our university environment. So I ended up inviting him out. So 6 a.m. training sessions on Tuesday mornings. I remember I got a text from him, and I think as a coach, it's still one of the things that I reflect on so much. And he said, you know, that was the first place that he felt safe and that he could be himself. And again, that was just a random group of people at 6 a.m. in this building on a turf field. But that moment for him, you know, was able to be a bit of a catalyst, right? To maybe go into some other spaces, or, you know, open up to maybe the soccer community can be an accepting place. So I think for me, like the why of, you know, what makes sport worth saving, like really a micro moment, but like can it literally be life-saving for sure.
Right. Well, can you unpack that a little further as to what do you think? Because I feel like that's replicated often, that sense of, okay, I can just be myself here for the most part, you know, because why? We talk about an even playing field, things like that, but what does that all mean? What do you think contributed to this individual sense of kind of, I can be myself?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that sticks with me is just creating an environment where you don't have to leave any part of yourself as you walk onto the field or you walk through the doors. I think too, you know, setting an example just in the folks coming in and just being themselves, right? We have a really weird, odd group, like lovely humans. They're absolutely fantastic, but they're 100% themselves. And I think too, like coming from a place of understanding and support and encouragement. And again, I'll probably always go back to this, but just intentionality, right? Like being intentional in that, like, this is what we want our environment to be about, and taking active steps to make sure that it is that type of environment. So I think, when we're trying to create an environment of belonging, you know, being intentional about it is huge.
We need you. My husband talks about that with rugby, that if someone shows up and they're kind of kicking rocks at the side of the field, people just naturally reach out. Hey, who are you? Come on in, join in. It's okay. You don't have your gear. We'll find you something, whatever, right? Very inclusive. Love it. And certain sports probably do a better job than others, but thank God there are those environments. Great. What do you think, Andrea? Is it worth saving?
Oh gosh, absolutely. There's so much that I can resonate with, right? Like if I go back to young Andrea, like I had athletic skills in 5th grade. And then I went off to learn more about like teenage things, and really got involved with bad crowds and was making bad decisions that my parents did not approve of. And the more that I became involved in sport, the more that I could channel my energies into something physical, my emotional and mental well-being became healthier. And again, I started to fit in a little bit better. I recall when I was in university and just having challenges that university brings on. And I'm talking to a counselor and he says, "What do you like about rugby?" I was like, honestly, I get to be as big and as strong and as powerful as I feel like I am on the inside. And I get to put that out there, and I get applauded for that, for beating people up on the field, because I can't do that if I'm not on the field. I will go to prison, right? And I remember it so clearly. And he was like, "Wow, that's really interesting. We're not usually socialized to be that way." So long and short of it is, I just think, we've talked about sport being an outlet. To take it a little bit further, I think it's one of the purest forms of human expression, right? We talk about art is one thing, and sport and athletic expression, I believe, is another way. And, as we have in the academic world, we have this, this mental need and curiosity. So it's just another piece of the puzzle in the world that we call life. Thank you.
Oh, and sport is all of that. I often say a coach is the ultimate educator, because they're responsible for the heart, soul, and body of those individuals in their care. Hey, oh, it's a big responsibility.
Yeah. And can I just follow up with that? Like, I don't want to separate sport as solely physical, right? Like, I think it definitely hits a spiritual realm for many people. I love the intellectual aspect of it, both on the field and off. So whether it's like the analytical breakdown of a game or a play, which I do professionally now, with some broadcasting, and as well, or off the field, right? As we are having these conversations that are within the realm of sport, but are tapping into those intellectual sides of things and that systemic thinking around whether it's the governance decisions or whether it's, where do we go from here type of questions. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's one of my later questions. So I'm just checking, make sure we're going to get there. We will. But that idea of, what can we take from sport? What could the world really take from sport? But I want to build on Andrea's point too about the channeling of the aggression, right? So often I'll get people challenging me, well, boxing is so violent and rugby is so violent. And I try to tease apart violence from aggression. So I do think sport, when done well, it can be such a channeling of that expression of aggression in a healthy way that is, it's not designed to harm someone necessarily, like you joke you're beating someone up, but you're tackling them, taking them around, but you're not trying to punch their lights out. Otherwise you don't have anybody play, right? Yeah. So I love that too, that with intentionality, it can really teach us how to do these natural tendencies more productively. Cool. What do you believe to be the big issues in sport? Like, what are the, we know there are stories about abuse and harm and corruption and cheating, and there are all these issues that are really threatening the lifeblood of sport in some ways, because some people are losing faith in it, right? So what do you see as the crucial kind of real points of concern for you that you're witnessing right now that are maybe at the center of some of these stories?
I'll jump in because I can reflect on working in the complaint management and conflict management space where you're receiving and viewing what people rightfully so feels is a violation of some of their rights in the sports space. And I think so often, first of all, you know, some of the key issues that we're also privy to are the instances of maltreatment that are true and exist and have been systemic in sport. I also think that there is a lack of skill set and a lack of ability to renegotiate some of these values that we want to see in sport that lead to safer, more positive and healthier sports spaces. And so beyond the very explicit cases of maltreatment, it's also going, what do people need to learn and understand so that they can accept and internalize good and healthy values in sport? And I think that that's a gap that we are seeing from the grassroots all the way to the NSO level. And that's also reflected in what the policies and practices look like. And so I think that that's a general way to start. I know I'll pass it over to the group for some other specific things to their spaces.
Well, and keep going a bit more, Sam. I know I got Danielle and Andrea on deck here too, but what are some of the skills you'd like to see us developing within sport that would probably help us?
Yeah, coming out of the conflict management program, one of the pieces that I value is alternative dispute resolution and is mediation. And we often think of that as being very reactive, but it's also being confident with addressing conflict as it shows up. And we are not necessarily seeing individuals have the confidence to take on those proper conflict responses. And that includes a lot of empathy, collaboration, ability to have inclusive leadership in your space. And there seems to be a lot of resistance and fear to that. And so it's going, how can we work with organizations and individuals to move past that fear? And whether that fear is fear of going through some process and being sanctioned or being punished in a punitive way, or whether that fear is of losing power, or whether that fear, which I would say the majority of time, is just simply the inability to say, I don't actually know what the right next step is here, and I don't know how to bring in help to work towards that. And I would really love to see more individuals across the sports space working towards that, and then legitimizing the views and experiences of all of the players and stakeholders in the sports system.
Which links beautifully into Danielle's work around leadership development as well, hey, and being more intentional and safe to learn as a leader. You know, you speak to that, Sam, where we're afraid to acknowledge we may not know something because in our mind we have these heroic leader models that aren't serving us very well. Danielle, I have you on deck. What would you like to contribute here to the issues?
The issues, yeah, I would say there's three main ones. One for me is lack of autonomy. So disconnecting athletes from their experience, you know, decisions being made about their experience without them. You know, I see this at the performance level all the way down to the grassroots level, right? Just coaches or folks in a certain room deciding on the experience of athletes. And I think within that, you know, that autonomy piece is ensuring athletes have a voice, or they feel like they have a voice in their experience. So, you know, not just about maybe the decision making, but if they're uncomfortable with something, right? If, you know, the experience isn't what they want it to be, that they have a voice. But again, we've, you know, kind of developed this system where athletes don't have that autonomy a lot of times. So that's a big one for me. Another one that I've already mentioned is the lack of focus, especially in that performance sports space, and intentionally using that space for leadership, social, human, and community development. There's a lot of pieces that go along with this. You know, within the research, we've seen some pieces within the university and college environment where, you know, coaches may think, you know, that's not my job. You know, that's the mental performance coach. That's an add-on that maybe we do once a month, but not actually intentionally creating that environment where it's, you know, a daily thing, you know, or I don't have time, competing priorities, all of those pieces. So I think part of that as well is recognizing the KPIs or the key performance indicators that we have within the system. A lot of times within the performance sports space, there's connected just with winning. right? Like that's the KPI. If we win, okay, we can keep going, right? Doesn't matter if we're developing leaders, doesn't matter, right? If we're developing our community. So I think that's part of that conversation for me, is fixing the issue of our KPIs, because we're just not getting the full benefit of performance sport like we can. And then the last one for me is a bit of a lack of questioning, or curiosity, in the sense of starting to question some of the values or the ideologies, especially, and again, I look at performance sports specifically, but the performance sport system that we've inherited, right? Sometimes we just assume the sport we have is what sport is. But is there a better sport out there, right, that we can strive towards? So I think starting to understand, okay, where are these values coming from, right? This win at all costs, different pieces like that. So yeah, I'd say the lack of autonomy, the intentionality, the lack of intentionality around using performance sport for its full benefit, not just performance sport, I think all sport. And then starting to question, some of our values and ideologies of what we just assume sport is.
Thank you. And Andrea, you had some comments.
Well, I think the most serious issues in sports today just comes down to like the endless hunt for like greed and status, the selfishness, sort of activities, also like the grandiosity of thinking, of stepping out of our roles. I think some things that I've seen within the most the best performing teams, both in sport and in like a corporate environment, is with role clarity, right? And then having trust within that structure, which can be very difficult, right? Because we start hearing these stories of corruption and what have you. But I always say it takes everybody, right? We can't just have athletes. We can't, calling all the shots. We can't just have the coaches calling all the shots. Like there needs to be some level of collaboration, but also, autonomy within their role. But then, also these open channels of communication and conversation from every level, or every area of the system, if we're not operating in a traditional hierarchical system, right? And we're starting to flatten those out, where into a more of a web type shape, where we have athletes and integrated support teams and coaches and administration and marketing, and it's just ever expansive. But on the topic of the gluttony or the selfishness, like I remember playing Fiji, and Fiji had very few resources, but the athletes on that team had a thought of like, if I have one banana, then I am going to share one banana with all 12 of my sisters, right? So then everybody gets a little bit, and everybody's better for it. The mentality that I had during my, I'll call psychopathic years, I'm like, if I have a banana, it's my banana, because I need to be better than you, and I need to secure my position on this team, and I need to get a gold medal. And it was not as enjoyable, right? And you just hear these awesome stories in sport. Tash going for the bronze medal in the 2016 Olympics was incredible. Fijiana ended up getting a bronze medal in the most recent Olympics, right? With that team first mentality. So thank you.
Team first. And yeah, what tips us right into one way or the other. And love this. It's quite a constellation of factors that I think you've summed up nicely, Andrea, that it all belongs, it all connects, and everybody is part of it. I love that web image as well. And there are many ways we can come into this system and impact it positively, whether it's around skill development, understanding your roles, gaining better clarity, creating channels to question and challenge, understanding that everyone is equal. We all are partners in this. It's not like there's this hierarchy. I think hierarchies are so dangerous for us in sport, and leads to that kind of weird gluttony and feeling like we have to be on top. It's very zero sum, hey? Let's keep digging in. I see some good conversation in the chat around, Andrea, you brought up this idea of, and I think it's actually unique to rugby, sorry, but a real respect for the codes and laws, maybe volleyball as well. There's a real deference to the referee, I find in volleyball, increasingly, like you can't even approach them anymore. I think that's good because it honors the rules of engagement and it keeps things very clear. I guess if it was an oppressive rule of engagement, then that would be great. But in sport, typically it's to facilitate the wonderful competition. But then you're countered with one of our attendees, Suzanne, who says, well, I'm also seeing that erode a bit. There's this public criticism and kind of social media refereeing, and we're seeing an increase of abuse of referees now too, right? So what is going on there, do you think? What do you think are some of the principles at play that are leading us into this very dangerous zone of almost forsaking those really crucial rules of engagement?
I'll jump in there and I think about it in regard to risk. And I recently heard somebody describe the risk that people take when they come onto a field of play. And when you look at your engagement in the sports system and you look at how you, whether it's as a player mostly or an official or a coach in that space, you sign on to what your expectation will be in that field of play. For a player, there's a certain amount of risk. If you fall, if you have a tackle, I don't know much about sports beyond rowing, so I'm not going to pretend that I can get into that dialogue, but you sign on to that type of risk. What you don't sign on to is the risk that you're now starting to experience when you see the violent behavior, which is different from the aggressive behavior. And you don't sign on to the power dynamics that can be so damaging. You don't sign on to the behavior between parents and referees against a referee. And I think that we're starting to really struggle with how we support people when they've now entered into this space and into this risk zone that is not what they expected when they sign on to sport, and yet we tolerate it. And I think one of the clear examples is when you look at the violence that we see, for example, in hockey, that's televised and we internalize that and we accept it, then people feel shocked on a soccer field when it's deemed inappropriate for somebody to essentially physically assault someone. Outside of that context, it would never be accepted. As Andrea referenced earlier, that is something that is criminal. Yet, in the sports space, we are really struggling to understand how do we look at those violent incidents and how do we look at this kind of extension or push past the risk that we expected to see in sport.
Very important. And I have a webinar coming up on pain and our interpretation of pain in sport, but I think risk is a crucial one to focus on, right? Are we pushing through a risk or a limit? And I think these conversations are happening in hockey, aren't they, around what kind of a hit is legal or is still within the channeling of aggression without actually conducive to harm, which it seems to be have been accepted for so long, and in football as well, right? And in lots of things. I mean, God, boxing, you're getting punched in the face. Other comments on that, on the rules of engagement and this kind of it almost seems very precarious right now, where it could go either way. And yeah, we've got lots of comments in the chat though, but comments on that question of the rules of engagement and honoring the code of sport. Are we still doing that? Is it getting better or kind of tipping into that eroded state that Suzanne was highlighting here? What do you think? Any other comments on that? Maybe Andrea, you could comment on what your thoughts are around the inherent respect for the codes and laws of the game.
Well, I think too, that comes when, like on the grander scale, right? We have an understanding, an unspoken contract that we come into when we engage in the game, and we have the referee to make sure that everybody is abiding by those. There's in every realm of this world, there's kind of a bad apple, so to speak, that might not have the same intentions and as the majority, and right, and that's where we have consequences. And in the world of rugby, it can be a yellow card, it can be a red card, it can be maybe you're not on the team anymore. But I'm also reading Akash's comment about democracies, and the word democracy stood out for me because when we're looking into this COPSI research and exploring, what are the most integrous types of governance structure, and it would be an oligarchy, right? Which is basically like the Knights of the Round Table. It's entrusting people who have the knowledge and the experience to choose and to decide what is best for the group, or best for the body that they are governing. It isn't necessarily offering a say for everybody, because not everybody has the same level of experience, the same level of training. Thinking about a family structure, right? Usually mom and dad who have had the experience, get to say what their 5-year-old does, right? That 5-year-old doesn't have the experience and the training that to successfully navigate life yet, right? But with the guidance and support from these from these experienced groups, or from the experience within the group, then it can bring the sport, the team, what have you, whatever that body is that's being governed, into a better place.
And still a partnership, still respecting the rights of that 5-year-old, right? It's not about locking them up in a little cage or something. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think, Akash, great question, because it is, how are we doing in Canada? It seems like we're floundering, hey, and we're getting there. We're figuring out how to create safe, and how this model of medals or owning the podium has led to some of these challenges. We're starting to understand that, but how did that happen? How do we get down this road, and why weren't we paying greater attention to some of these models that had failed and elsewhere? And yeah, what's missing in terms of the actual education within our system? Awesome. All right. Can you tell us a little more about your studies? I'd love to hear and have you share and showcase some of the work that you're doing. So Andrea's talked a bit about the work around the COPSI network and what became clear in COVID. Again, truth in sport, when we face adversity, we come together. We have to rely on one another. We have to trust. We have to get clear and communicate a lot. And it's interesting, once COVID is fading, the communication is starting to fade again, and people are sort of siloing and not keeping those channels as open. It's interesting. So where's that intentionality and understanding, appreciation for the value of that? Time tends to take precedent, seems, hey? So what made you choose the perspective you chose? We have people working on culture, leadership, conflict, equity, access, communication. We all kind of pick a lens. I tend to pick culture all the time and communication, but why? Why do you find yourself drawn to that, or how do you see that perspective contributing productively to our understanding and reshaping of sport in Canada? Anybody like to start? Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
I can jump in here. Yeah, I'm focusing mostly on the leadership in sports, and like what leaders do in sports, and it kind of loops into a bit what Andrea and Sam were talking about with like these rules and regulations, or like with rowing, we talk about standards and expectations sometimes, of like how you hold yourself accountable and how you hold the team accountable to each other. And the reason I wanted to study like leadership in sport is because a lot of times, especially in sport, people think of leaders as like, oh, that's the coach, or oh, that's the team captain. But really, like, anybody on a team can be a leader. And it's really how you encourage people to, or individuals to like lead by example, or like show what how to act in certain spaces. And I guess like how I'm struggling to just come up with the words, I guess. This is why my paper's not written yet. But kind of like just leading the way, like leading by example, showing everybody, like anybody can be a leader. And the more leaders there are, and the more people that are like living to those good values and everything, the better off all these standards and expectations, I think, will be. And that's kind of why I'm studying this, is just try to broaden what a leader is and what they do, and how leaders can be effective in sport. Stumble a lot through that, but hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and Danielle and I have rallied around the word leadership a lot too. And some people, I find a lot of people resonate with it, even though it's a bit vague, but it does capture those, the ethics and the courage and the communicate, the skill, that Sam talked about too, is all part of, and this, team first, or thinking about the whole, being a facilitator of good things. Yeah, I think it's pretty crucial. What else? Tash, why did you come at it from culture?
Yeah.
Or psychological safety really is what you were honing in on. Yeah.
Yeah. So leaving rugby, I felt there was always something missing in how we were being prioritized as athletes and viewed and treated. And that was really about looking at the whole person as a person and not just as an athlete. And that dove into kind of the psychological games as an athlete that you can get into and how your coach can really and team can support that. So it started for me on the really drive to learn more about it and what creates a psychologically safe space, but also that is high performing, because I think we know both can support each other and are possible together. And through that, it was actually perfect. I mean, not unfortunate and good timing is the investigation underwent with the women's sevens team. And we could do that study and understand what went down and what were all the different aspects that led to this big case. And when we continue to learn, it's top down. The organization has a part in it. There's all these systems that are coming in and impacting it. So after that study, Jen and I are pursuing a cultural analysis to see what is the current state of like Rugby Canada's values, what they stand by, what they want to be perceived, and what actually is happening on the outside. So we've taken an appreciative inquiry lens because there were things that were working. Our team in Rio was super successful. We were consistently on the podium. So there was something there, and we don't need to get rid of all of that because of this case. But figuring out how to align better with the organizational values and to create just a safer and better environment for the athletes. I think that sums it up.
Yeah, and sustain it. And it was interesting. I mean, I've taken great interest in watching the Rugby Canada case unfold and how the board addressed the challenges, how they undertook a review, what the outcomes of that were, and how they responded. It's been fascinating, and in many ways aligns with, I think, the values they espouse. But we are seeing, I was part of that little presentation, we're seeing some incongruities as well. So how do we bring those into alignment? And all these organizations are learning that. And so I've got a question in the chat around equity in particular. Is there someone that would like to speak to that? What do you think? I know a number of you have looked at equity as an important lens to look at, to study sport through, or to try to contribute to sport in this way. Would anybody like to speak to that? What's important to focus on? And then the specific question is around what can we be doing from the ground up to enhance our understanding and honoring of equity within sport. Go ahead.
Yeah, so previous to I ended up leaving my position this past fall, but I was working at Canadian Women in Sport for about 1.5 years. So this is kind of my world was advancing gender equity within the Canadian sports system. And absolutely, right. We know, I mean, that's a big part of equity is addressing and readdressing those historical imbalances. And again, recognizing that we're not starting on an even playing field, especially for the experiences for girls, women, and gender diverse folks. So I think, I mean, that's a big one for me. I know, within the organization at Canadian Women in Sport, we talked a bit about girl-centered sport. But for me, I think it's, again, autonomy-centered sport. When we talk about creating great sport experiences and great sport spaces, for girls, I think there's aspects of that boys or gender diverse folks will love as well. right? So I think, you know, if we can really hone in on that autonomy centered piece, that girls and women and gender diverse folks have a voice in their experience, right? That they're being asked what they want, that they're connected with their bodies, that they're having, you know, a safer space to be able to experience the sport they want to experience. So I think that's kind of the very first thing. Because again, I'm kind of integrating myself into grassroots sports again. That's one of the biggest things. I was like, well, have you asked them? Right? We're making decisions on a women's league. Have you asked them? Right? You're making decisions on, you know, a girl's, we call it performance. It's, you know, the highest level that you might play at a U15, U17 level for girls, right? But, you know, training 4 or 5, 6 days a week. Have you asked them? Is that what they want? Right? So I think that's central is, you know, that question of including those voices is massive. And again, you know, I think it also starts with just educating folks around equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility, right? I think there's a lot of misconceptions. So I think understanding, you know, why that work is so important. And again, just understanding the concept of equity is important in that as well.
Yeah, because in your example, we're making these assumptions that, well, of course you want to be the best in whatever region, and it's going to take this, and maybe they don't. You know, maybe I don't want to be that. Maybe that's not the shared goal. So clarifying that, great. Comes back to your questioning or assumptions. Is there this disparity in terms of ability, race, gender, what's going on in sport that we have been tolerating this crazy disparity for so long? So love all the work that all of you are doing. I think gets to those questions. Anyone else comments on what it would take or why it's important to focus on equity as a lever within sport?
I think around what it would take to kind of jump on what Danielle was saying, when I reflect on a lot of the research as well as just a lot of the conversations we've been having in the sports space, there's a clear lack of representation among the decision makers of the equity deserving groups. And so my research is specific to para sport, but there's a lot of parallels in gender equity. And it was going, well, wait a second, why are the people who are representative of the membership not reflected in who the decision makers are? And we seem to really struggle to value both lived experience and expertise, and the expertise that is developed through lived experience, among other things. And I think that the more we see, and we're starting to see it, I know in the latest Canadian Women in Sport report, we're starting to see more equitable boards and at our kind of leadership circles, but we're not there yet. I think that one of the other pieces has been simply taking risky and courageous decisions and where you financially invest. And oftentimes there's so much conversation around why there can't be a financial investment in something. And I'll reflect, I'll use the soccer as an example. I think it was basketball where people were going, yeah, there's no viewership for women's basketball. And then everybody went, well, that's because it's not available on TV to watch. And the moment that investment changed and it came on live television, all of a sudden you saw this representative and beautiful viewership. And so when we just take the risk to do the financial decisions, and I think Serena Williams, for example, over 50% of the startups that she invests in right now are with women-owned organizations. And so you're starting to see individuals put the money in those spaces. And I think that will start to change what equity looks like. But it requires kind of moving past those old arguments around there's no data or research to support why we should invest in this space.
Yes, U of A actually experimented, because I would often get that when I would talk to the athletic director at UVic, that, well, the women they play during dinner because they don't bring in the box office, right? And yet U of A then experimented with that and found the exact opposite. It was true that whoever's playing, people will come and watch, just make sure it's not during dinner. And lovely to see. And I'm not sure that everyone's picking up on that though. And then investing is crucial. It's another way to communicate our values, right? That we're actually valuing something by investing time, energy, resources, money. Love it. Chauncey was asking about leadership, and Andrew's having a good conversation with him in the chat, but that touches on a number of your perspectives as well. Why is developing people as leaders? I've been lately using the word champions, that a champion doesn't just have a shiny medal. They are also, ethical and facilitators, and they are giving back, and they are, good people helping others. So they've learned that from sport, and they've learned how to do that in sport, and now they're bringing it to their community. It's crucial. Do you think it's expanding? And Andrew's given some good examples. What do you think? How are we doing on the leadership development front through sport? I think, again, it's precarious. There are some really dangerous approaches, a lot of money being invested in these kind of academies, and where people are making money off of kids. That could be dangerous. There's no incentive to stop that either. So how do you think we're doing, and what's helping us develop athletes through sport, leadership through sport? I'm seeing some good work with the Canadian Sports School, for instance, as well. Why is it important? Why do you want your athletes to be leaders, Jane? If you think about your crews.
Yeah, I guess when I think of a good leader, I think of someone who can listen, and someone who understands what's going on around them, and adapt as they see fit. Not everything happens the way that you want it to happen. You write a training plan, but then it's too windy and you can't row, so you have to make an adjustment. And the same thing happens just in the team in general, or any kind of team. And I feel like leaders generally, or good leaders, in my own opinion, typically care about the people around them. They want to see them succeed, so they'll do what they can to help them succeed, and in turn that will help them personally succeed as well. And I think that's what a few people have been saying as well. It's more of a focus on the bigger picture, as opposed to just myself. So I think the focus on developing more leaders, you'll have more people with that same vision of if I help everyone around me, it will also help myself to get to where I want to be, and where we the team want to be as well. Yeah.
Beautiful. And really reflects what the banana story from Andrea, right? Sharing the banana. Love it. Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, I want players and sports organizations to be good leaders, because it's the right thing to do. And when we have integrity, and when we do the right thing, when nobody's watching, the winning, and it's like a magnet, right? The funding comes, the winning comes, the performance comes, right? It has this big snowball effect. People enjoy the process. We're in it together. We're resilient, and we adapt. So many times it's starting to stop. But to talk about Chauncey's comment here, the sexism in hockey is a perfect example. For years, watching professional sports, most often in the examples that are coming to mind, it would be criminal activity amongst athletes in professional sport organizations. And then they get to play the next day, right? Because money's on the line and we need to win, yada, 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 yada. Well, I'll tell you what, the All Blacks, as men's rugby 15s team out of New Zealand, has had an ethos on their team that says no fill in the blank allowed, right? No jerks allowed. And they are one of the most winningest teams in history, not only in men's rugby 15s, but in history, period. So when you're a good person and you do the right thing, good things happen. It just happens. Thank you.
Great quote from Richie McCaw. I always use as well, that on a team of 15, like a 15s team, there's one captain, but 15 leaders. So back to Jane's point, Danielle's point. Yeah. Thank you. Danielle.
I think just to add on to that, I think a lot of times what we see, and I mentioned it previously, is that this leadership development piece is like an add-on to the experience, right? Whereas what Andrea is talking about is like integrated right into the culture, right? So that's what we know within the literature as well, right? Is even if you can have these leadership development programs for coaches, they can actually be more ineffective if the coach isn't actively involved with that or believes in it. Because again, right, if I'm a super authoritative coach, I'm going to take away those leadership development opportunities for my athletes, right? So within my research, I look at transformational leadership, right? That's all about developing more leaders, right? So if I'm not role modeling that, my athletes aren't learning about it. And then if I'm also holding those leadership opportunities for myself, right, with the control, it's hard as a coach to give that control to someone else. Again, right, we're limiting the leadership opportunities for the folks within our program. So I think to Andrea's point, like it's so important that it's not just this add-on, but it's like completely integrated into like the ethos, the experience, right? Like just who we are and what we do.
Yeah, and there has to be a motivation for it to be intentional, isn't it? Right? You actually have to see the value in relinquishing some of that control will actually feed back into the strength and your success as a coach. Tash, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna add, and it's something that popped out to me when I was doing my master's, is this idea of athletes or people being born leaders, but really that's not. We are all leaders and we all have the ability to be a leader. And something that really changed my mindset and way of thinking is how leaders need to understand self first. And if coaches, if top up people can understand their own biases and their being and their impact, and then you can look to lead others after that and invite them in. I think that will have a huge impact. But leadership can also be expressed in multiple ways. I think in rugby, you have ones that show by example. They don't want to give big speeches. That's not me either. That's not me. And you see it in different ways. And I think that needs to be recognized too. Leader is not just the person who's the coach or the captain. There's so many people you're surrounded with that will showcase different types of leadership, which, yeah, that's why I appreciate champions. Like Jen was saying, I think that's really cool.
And a strengths approach, right, which kind of circles back to some of the initial comments around strengths-based, and we can all lead in different ways. I think it's why I love rugby so much. I've never played it, but God, I love watching it. So many different roles and bodies and types, and everyone can lead. And I think it's less visible in rowing because we all strive to be so synchronous, but of course there's such unique individuals in that boat, and they all of course have to contribute in their own way to make it all work smoothly and feel that they can contribute. They have something, a role to play. I wanted to ask a little more about, keep going here. So Andrea, maybe comment on your responding here in the chat, but bring that out a little bit more, and Sam as well.
Go ahead, Sam.
Sure. I think in responding to Chauncey and talking about trying to create more opportunities for the provincial and club level organizations, when we think of those organizations, they're the ones that are accessing new members to a sports system, and they're the ones that are probably accessing the largest amount of people. And so often I find that the resources are concentrated at the top, at the national sport organization level. And we forget to, or I'll go back to Danielle's comment around KPIs, we don't necessarily think to invest, support, and ensure that the people with the best skill set for leadership development exist at the grassroots level, because that's the first exposure and that's the first opportunity to build a skill set in young leaders and to ensure that the athletes, I really love, Danielle, your point around autonomy, ensure that the athletes and the individuals understand what it means to exercise that autonomy as they progress through the system. And if we flipped that, instead of waiting until people come all the way up to the NSO level and may have been harmed or just unsure of how to challenge power or unsure of simply how to navigate and advocate for themselves, then you're doing so much reactive work to solve that instead of putting some of these preventative pieces in place. So I think a shift there and a shift in where we invest is really crucial to going back to how do we save sport, which is one of those beginning questions today.
Yeah, and really get clear on the purpose of sport. What is success in sport? And earlier we had the question around what is excellence? Because I think, again, we've so quickly just said excellence is winning a medal. And it can be, but it's bigger than that, right? So what are we actually trying to achieve in sport? What's it for? To what end? And Andrea, you had some more to say about leadership development.
I think it comes down to our, what are we in service to, right? Who and what are we serving? So the professional sport organizations or high performance sport, I mean, on some level, the athletes opt in, like they really want to be there. They really want to thrive. It's part, kind of part of their fabric. What's so fascinating about those amateur and youth sport levels is they are really opting in, right? They can really spend their money and their time wherever they want. So like at the end of the day, who's calling the shot? So I love this thing about creating access and opportunities, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's funding, but just even having a coach there at an arena or at a field to run a session can go a really long way. On Bowen Island in West Vancouver, they have a situation where if there's a field, they leave the community puts a ball on that field. That ball doesn't belong to anybody. But it's creating an opportunity and access, right? So it's just amazing because it's ingrained in us as human beings that people, kids, adults, whoever will walk by and they see a ball there and they just start playing with it. That is one level of recreation. It's one level of sport, and it really doesn't take much, right? So just have again, it's so simple, a ball on a field, right? No, and we can definitely self-organize in some ways. Thank you. I hope that answers the question.
And it's a real key concept that kids learn right away. I think of Timbit soccer, and we're telling kids to share, and then someone takes the ball, but they're not really taking the ball from you. You're still sharing, right? And sharing it, setting up someone else for a goal instead of taking it yourself, and understanding that actually moving the ball around is going to be much more productive. It's a beautiful skill to be learned. I'm not sure we make it explicit enough when we're teaching these kids these concepts that, but again, if we put leadership development or the development of that human being for the sake of the greater, right at the forefront, right from little tots upward, it would sure shift everything, wouldn't it? So purpose, excellence, service. What about, I want to just circle in on one more thing, but I also want to invite the audience to put up their hands if you have a comment you'd like to make or a question you'd like to ask in the last minutes. But I also want to come in on leadership development and conflict. We often think of sport as a conflict, or a battle is a word used, a contest. And then, of course, I know Sam has done some work around conflict specifically. But as part of a leadership development pathway or process, what kind of conflict skills, or how should we think about conflict in sport? How should it be clarified, or how do you think about it? Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I've taken out of the Mount program really is just like how to listen. And I think where conflict really blows out of proportion is when people are just unwilling to listen and hear what the other side is. Like a lot of times with big arguments, one person is arguing one side, someone else is arguing the other side, and just both parties, when things blow up, they're not willing to hear or even willing to learn why the other person has the stance that they have, or the opinions that they have, or their reasoning for doing something. And I think what we can teach more of the leaders is just like how to listen, this like deep listening, model that is taught at Roller Roads a lot, which I love. And I take into my athlete meetings all the time. And it's just, you almost empty your mind of what you feel is the right thing for you. And you fully listen to everything that they have to say without interruption, and let the other person get their point across. And then you can comment or bring your point of view to the foreground, but more, just teaching people how to listen, and listen deeply, not just hearing one words go in one ear out the other and like forming your argument as they're talking, but take it in, absorb it, and then comment later.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I think that's the core principle of our bridge metaphor too, of deep understanding of both perspectives before you try to actually make a connection. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll reflect on the research I did in the adaptive and parasport space, as well as for the leadership development program, showed that a lot of times in addressing conflict, the biggest inhibitors to it were fear, whether it was fear of challenging power, fear of losing funding, fear of losing status or positive regard. And then the other piece beyond fear in that conflict space was not understanding how to engage in those conversations without it becoming a hugely litigious process or a hugely punitive process. And so how do we foster a conflict skill set that also addresses that oftentimes this conflict will also show up because of systemic inequities or because of organizational inequities, and we're not necessarily incorporating that into our view of a conflict skill set. And so really supporting, fostering how to address those pieces, how to come at, similar to what Jane said around listening, how to come at the conversation with empathy and compassion, as well as beyond the really escalated, entrenched conflicts, which is where we get to quite quickly these days, is understanding that people generally want similar outcomes, right? And how do we start to channel that? And I would say almost mandate some alternative dispute resolution type practices and processes to build that skill set and ensure people have it.
Love it. Links really nicely into Tennille's question here for each of you to finish off. If you could mandate something that needs to be introduced into the sports space, coaching specifically, she's asking about, but it could be, I think, any leader within the space, because a lot of people are kind of coaches without having to be the actual coach of the athlete team. What would you like to see introduced into the sport, or enhanced or highlighted or brought to the forefront? What do you think? Go ahead.
I'll jump in, and I'm going to go to what Danielle said around, can coaches support athletes in accessing autonomy? And I think for me that links to agency, and so that would be really important for me, for coaches at that level.
Right, Andrea?
Yeah, it's that if they don't make it in this sport, instill the belief that if they don't make it in their sport, if they don't make it on this selection or on their team, it's not a reflection of who they are as a human being, right? That we have a job to do, and there's only so many spots, and it's not, it's not favorable, but you're still worth something. You're still wonderful, and this isn't your shot. And perhaps that's about building resilience. I know it's not really warm and fuzzy, but I think it does speak to a little bit of a reality of what sports can often bring.
Those important conversations. Go ahead, Danielle.
Yeah, I think what I'd love to see immediately is for coaches at all levels to use leadership development as their process and their outcome. So process and driving performance, but also outcome as in that's what we're measuring, right? So can we tie in a KPI with leadership development, right? Not just focusing on winning as our KPI.
Thank you. Tash?
Right. I think just seeing athletes as a whole person and not just an athlete. I think that would be great.
And Jane, you've got the last word.
Well, no pressure. I'm just gonna jump off what Tash said. Yeah, just making sure that the like mental and physical well-being, like both together, is what coaches and NSOs and everyone, PSOs are all focused on. It's not always the case, and we need to be there.
And I love seeing Irene Wallace, former, played for her for a little while there, basketball, on the call and suggesting how do we keep involved? And of course, I see all of you still involved, but really want to encourage everyone to stay involved and keep working. And I love the word fighting, but working for positive development within sport. It is worth saving, as so many of you made very clear. And as you can see by the numbers of people that keep coming to participate in these conversations, it's highlighting for me just how much it matters to Canadians. And I love how you all touched on so many aspects of, developing the human being for the sake of society, lots of different avenues into doing that. There's no one right way. And thank you all for all the great work that you're doing, for participating today, for sharing your stories, your insights, your brilliance. And thank you everybody for coming to attend the session. It's really great to see you all.